Hello, I'm Toycat, and there are hundreds of countries which used to exist on this planet but now don't anymore. And in general, when a country stops existing, its territory doesn't vanish with it, with very few exceptions at least, and this means that every country that used to exist now has territory which is ruled by some modern day nation state. These modern day nation states have some claim to continuity or some relationship at the very least with this past state, and so there are 7 different ways this relationship can pan out, which means there are 7 different ways that a country can stop existing. I figured it'd be worth giving an example for each of these today and explaining everything from Persia to the USSR to Austria-Hungary to help you understand when you hear about some historical country how it links into the modern world. This is a part of the fundamentals of geography, and I'm looking forward to starting with the easiest example here because the USSR was obviously one of the world's most famous country, the world's second power in lots of ways. That's where the term Second World came from. If you were allied with this country, you were basically in a whole second part of the world alliance, and the USSR doesn't exist anymore. Instead, there are lots of constituent Soviet republics, and most of these Soviet republics would just say, yeah, the USSR doesn't really exist anymore, whereas Russia might argue the USSR collapsed, sure, but Russia took over its role. All of its international duties and the nukes and everything else like that went to Russia, which is the successor state to the USSR, whereas all of the other countries that broke away, like Turkmenistan, this always seems wild to me that Turkmenistan was part of it, but Turkmenistan would just be like, yeah, we broke away, that's when we got our independence, and a lot of countries would say, yeah, we got our independence, and we weren't ever willingly a part of it, but this is an interesting part of bigger countries that break up. There are obviously examples where, like Yugoslavia, where a country breaks up into lots of constituent countries, and there is still a successor state. Serbia claims to be the successor state of the Yugoslavia. However, interestingly, because there is a slightly smaller percent of its territory and of its population that live there, it's a slightly weaker claim. Internationally, it might be true, but it's a little bit messier in reality. So yeah, one country becomes lots of countries, and then there is sometimes a state that continues on from it, but they obviously don't hold all of the territory or the people, and sometimes they just hold some bitter feelings about how it broke up, and they're not a big fan of that, which is very interesting. So this is a case of a country breaking up because lots of places go independent, and then the independent countries are the modern day example, but you can also see the exact opposite if we move to the United States. The United States has the most famous breakaway republic that failed in history, I would say, because of the Confederate States of America. Whether it's most famous because it's most important, or whether it's most famous because, you know, American media, is something we could debate all day, but instead let's talk about the fact that lots of states tried to leave the United States of America. There was an attempted breakaway republic formed, and this breakaway republic eventually was reintegrated back into the United States. There are all sorts of fun issues that kind of stem from this one right here. There are all sorts of fun ways that these states have differences that you can still spot to this day, but basically these places try to make their own country, they were their own country, and then that country had to go back. Fun fact, this isn't the only one in the world. Here is the Republic of Canada. It was a small island called Navy Island that had about a couple hundred people that moved there because they were trying to make their own country, and in the end what happened is they were fired on by the British Army and eventually had to leave. And wild is the fact that they had a currency plan, they have this lovely flag, you know, actually they have this ugly flag, and they also have a whole plan, but that kind of disintegrates when it comes into impact with the actual armies which control existing countries, which don't really like being broken up in that way. So there is a third example of this. There are countries which broke apart and now don't exist anymore. There's countries that tried to break apart and now the, you know, dissident parts don't exist anymore. And then there's a case of a third example where a country breaks apart but kind of never really, where you know, the former part isn't really that recognizable, and the existing parts, it's not really that it collapsed, it's just that everything left at the same time. And so a great example of this comes in the Middle East. If you had to guess 3 countries in the Middle East that once were a part of the same, which 3 countries would you guess? Because you're probably not going to guess the actual truth. This is the United Arab States. This was a formation of the United Arab Republic with a little bit over here, as you can see, a little bit of Yemen, and it was one of the most bizarre countries, I think, that you can look at in history, because when it fell apart, it just fell apart because Syria said, oh yeah, we're leaving this alliance because of a coup we're having, and then eventually the whole thing just fell apart. It wasn't a ceremonial, collapse. It was just like, oh yeah, we're leaving, and so I guess there's nothing left anymore, which is one of the most bizarre ways that a country, a former state can exist and then not anymore. A similar thing could sort of be described with the Central American states. There are lots of times where countries have tried to get together, and then it just hasn't really ever succeeded in the first place, and the United Arab States are a really great example of that. By the way, when looking at this map, I know you can't not be curious about this big blob of French West Africa. This is a case of a place that isn't really a country to begin with, and this is one of the things about historical maps that starts to get confusing, is lots of the places on this map are countries. Over here there are countries, over there are countries, but lots of places aren't really properly administered as countries because there is a minimum level of governance you need to have set up that way, and even being a possession is a very loose term to describe most of the world for most of history, which is one of the important things about countries and how they exist. But speaking of countries and how they exist, I'm going to use a spicy example for my next one here, because there is a fourth way that a country can cease to exist, and I want to use a country which might sound confusing, but let's use the Kingdom of England as an example. There is no longer a Kingdom of England. In fact, there is no longer an England that exists as a country. And that is a controversial take because, oh, Toycat, of course England's a country. I'll show you on a map right here. Look, you can click it. There is England. It's a country that is part of the United Kingdom. I don't know why the UK is the only place that gets away with this in the world. You can't call it a country within a country. Either country means the big, up there definition, the sovereign state that is part of the UN, or country means subdivision of a nation. And we kind of get to play it both ways in the UK, but there is no longer a sovereign Kingdom of England. England cannot make its own laws separate to that of Wales and Scotland. At the very least, it has to do so with the consent of the MPs from all of those countries. And so in general, there is no longer an England or a Scotland. These places exist administratively and they exist historically, but they aren't countries anymore. Even more fun, by the way, because England actually conquered Wales a long time ago, is if we take a closer look at the Kingdom of England, you can see it actually includes all of Wales. And so that's my, in case you don't agree with my controversial point, I think you'll agree that there is certainly no England and Wales anymore. Although, legally speaking, there's something called like the free courts. There's a court that covers the island of Ireland, there's a Scottish court system, and there's an English and Wales court system. So in a way, England and Wales does still exist, but in the real sense, i.e. anyone who doesn't care enough about the country to learn about its subdivisions, there is one country over here called the United Kingdom, and that will be coming up later. But for a less contentious example, there is no longer a Republic of Texas. Actually, I think a lot of Texans think there is. There is no longer a Republic of California. Okay, some Californians think there is. In general, when a country becomes annexed into some larger country, it generally retains some of its independent spirit, and so a lot of people will be like, yeah, we're a part of an independent country that just happens to be inside of another one. And that is one of the wild things about sovereignty in the world, is people love this idea of being able to do their own stuff, and even when it's not true, they still want to believe it is very strongly, which is why if you believe very strongly in this channel, you might enjoy it that we move into the next one here, because this is the flag of Bop Who That Swana. This is one of the most interesting examples of this in the world. See, do you think that was going to be a pitch for something a second ago? Bet you did, huh? Speaking of pitches, let me pitch to you my new idea for a country. So imagine if you were to split up a country here, right? And the Kingdom of the United Kingdom came together because all those countries came apart. And then there's cases like the USSR where it all split apart. What if there was a case of a country that went independent, not because it was trying to break away, but because it was made independent by some greater power and then not truly recognized? That's what happened in South Africa. South Africa deliberately split itself up into lots of different countries, and one of the 4 republics that it made it part of was called Bop Who That Swana. They have a flag, I kind of like it, it's got a cheetah on, they've got this coat of arms, and they had this territory, which is one of the messiest countries that you can name in history. These weird exclaves and the way they were governed is one of the reasons that these countries were never truly internationally recognized, although if you look at the flags, they all had territory, they all had all the things that you need to be a independent country, except that international support. And this is a weird case where the country wanted international support, the country which was making them independent gave them international support, but at the same time the world said, we think you're just doing apartheid things, and what can you do to respond to that? The answer of your South Africa is just keep trying anyway, and so the Republic of Bop Who That Swana existed all the way until the 90s when apartheid ended, at which point all of these territories were reintegrated back into South Africa. And so it's a weird case of, it's sort of like the Confederate States of America or Republic of Canada or the Republic of Florida or any plenty of these other weird breakaway countries. But when it comes to South Africa, it can't really be described in the same way, which is beyond bizarre if you ask me. Speaking of beyond bizarre, if you ask me, I should also mention for one more less controversial case when it comes to that of England, I just want to quickly mention that Tanzania used to include Zanzibar, rather there was a Tanzania and a Zanzibar, and they merged together to make this, but Zanzibar does still exist and you still can visit Zanzibar, but they don't claim to be a country in most cases. So good job, Zanzibar. The one, Africa has some of the messiest things to do with countries, and it also has some of the more successful examples of integrations of countries, which is why I'm looking forward to the East African Federation. It will merge together one day, I'm telling you now. Speaking of things I'm going to tell you now, I think that leaves us with a couple more country examples to go through, and one of these is going to relate to Persia. Do you know where Persia is on a map? You can try and type it in all you like, but you won't find Persia, even though it's a historical place. So what happened to Persia? The simple answer is you can look through all of the empires and you'd be like, well, the Achaemenid Empire went all over here, and then it became the Persian Empire, and then the other Persian Empire, and you can really dive into the timeline of this, and it's really, really ridiculous. Or you can say, yeah, the way that Persia stopped existing is partially through loss of some of its territory, but much more is the fact that in the 1930s, Iran was going through a big reformist streak, and they decided to part with the old Persian name, which implied a kingdom, and instead they decided to name themselves Iran. Iran is the name that is stuck, and because it has this weird political tension to it, calling it Persia is not offensive, but it's just not done on any official government level, even though that is the historical name for the country. Iran, of course, has no other issues besides the name they call themselves. It's a very wonderful place this time of year. I definitely recommend visiting, but what I also recommend visiting, if you're looking for more adventurous holiday destinations than Iran, is I would definitely say try a trip to this place. This is New Swabia, and it's the final case because the first 6 examples are the first real ways that a country can stop existing, but there's also the very rare case that kind of comes back to this meme. This sounds like a joke, right? But this territory doesn't exist, and so therefore the country that used to exist there doesn't exist anymore, except the country never existed. But what if there was territory which does exist but doesn't have a country on anymore? Well, that is silly, because the overwhelming majority of the planet has some country that claims it. The only cases where this aren't true are things like this territory triangle, where neither country claims it, but both countries agree that it belongs to the other. But there are very few places where the whole world agrees, yeah, there's just no country there, and the only key example is Antarctica, which is why New Swabia is an example of a territory which was formed, if you're curious, it was by the Germans in the late 1930s to early 1940s period. So, not the best Germans, but it was formed by the Germans, and, to give them credit, that I don't believe there are any Jews in this territory, so, clearly achieving that mission goal. Should have just moved to Antarctica. Bad man. We could have saved millions of lives if we'd have just moved him here. But anyway, the point here is to say is New Swabia doesn't exist anymore, and there is no country that takes its place, and most places don't recognize that there is any country that has any claim here, and so New Swabia exists no longer. Another case could be given in the Islands of Refreshment. This was a sovereign country made by this fella right here. He's got a lovely picture, but it was made by this fella. It has their own flag, and it has some territory in St. Christian de... Basically, it existed as a country, right? And they were sovereign until they decided not to be, and it's a whole big problem. They were annexed, etc. However, if you look at the territory, if you were to look at St. Christian de Cunha, you can see that there is, in fact, one little settlement of about a couple hundred people. They have a bar. I'm curious, they have Google reviews for the bar. Fantastic pub. Oh wow, this is actually someone who went here. Book one people because it's full of people. Make sure you get the frog wings, go back home on the donkey. Do you see how it has bars and stuff, but no one will go here because this is one of the most remote places on Earth. However, the other refreshment islands have 0 people living on them. This is literally called Inaccessible Island, and it's kind of hard to imagine and hard to believe, but it is in fact very much inaccessible. And then there's Nightingale Islands over here. No people live on these islands, although there's a hiking trail if you want to give it a shot. And so if no people live on these islands, sure, it might technically not be a part of the Islands of Refreshment anymore, and it might technically now be part of Tristan da Cunha, which is not really a country because it's part of the United Kingdom more broadly, even though they have their own currency and their own flags and laws, and we'll talk about that another time. Do they have lobsters on their on their flag right here. This is amazing. Okay, so anyway, the important thing here is to say that it is a British overseas territory, so it's barely a country as it is, and that country is basically right over here. It technically rules this territory, but it never really, these are inaccessible islands. These are islands which have no people on them, and so is it really a part of something that exists now? If you don't agree with that, then New Swabia is the best example, but countries can disintegrate entirely if the territory on which they exist goes away, and this sounds like a hypothetical. Like, well, that's never actually going to happen, because Antarctica still exists. There is a New Swabia former land that will one day be ruled by someone, but a great example of this that I really want to give is going to be the Maldives. The Maldives is going to be a country that will soon no longer exist. Sea level rises predict this is somewhere between 2050 and 2100, but soon there will be no Maldives, and when there is no Maldives, what happens to their territory? It becomes a former country, not just in the legal sense, but also in the territorial sense. This is something that I think Tuvalu is also scared of. I'll be honest with you, every time I look for Tuvalu, I'm like, why? But Tuvalu is also going to go under. You can see it basically looks like it's underwater right now, to be honest with you. But this is a country that will not exist, and its territory will go away with it. This is something that probably applies to a lot of the Pacific eventually over a long enough time period, but there are countries which will stop existing and will have no, successor state. There will just be, there was a country, and then there is ocean, which I think is beyond fascinating. Speaking of things that are beyond fascinating, I hope that you have enjoyed this video and found it to be precisely that. If you did, then I am starting this fun little series. I want to go through the fundamentals of geography. A lot of people enjoyed my very brief guide as to where countries make their capitals, and I think it'd be useful to explain some of the things like that help you explain the history and the geography of the world in a slightly more segmented way. And if you didn't enjoy this video, then consider going to patreon.com/toycat, where you can give me money to make more of them. That's a bad pitch, isn't it? Let me try that again. If you didn't enjoy this video, then give me money, and maybe I won't make terrible ones like it again. That's probably where the money goes. It's probably not just going to kebabs. I'm lying to you. It's all going to go on kebabs and fun drinks. But anyway, yeah, it allows me to make things like this and feel like it's a good decision, and even hire an editor like we have right now. But yeah, thank you for watching. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye, Morocco, apparently.